So good morning and welcome to our webinar, Do We Need Theory to Teach Speaking Skills? I'm Tamsin Hart from Cambridge University Press, and I'll be hosting this webinar for our speaker, Peter Lucantoni. We're running these webinars to support you and your students, whilst you continue to adapt to teaching and learning remotely. Today, our focus is on English as a second language teaching. Before I run through an overview of what Peter will be covering today, let me tell you about the webinar itself. We're recording the webinar to share with you afterwards, so don't worry if your internet drops out during the webinar. If you're having trouble with your speakers, we suggest using headphones or checking that your speaker isn't muted. Your microphones will remain muted throughout the webinar. During the webinar, Peter will ask you to interact with him at different points. Please, can you use the chat function for that? Now, I don't know if everyone knows, but at the bottom of this screen, if you hover just at the bottom, all these different options will come up, and one of those is the chat function. So Peter's going to ask you to use that. If you have any technical issues of any kind, or questions about our English as a second language products at Cambridge University Press, please can you use the Q&A at the bottom. So that function is just near the chat. So when you hover at the bottom, you should be able to see the Q&A. And if you have any questions to Peter, Peter will be taking questions at the end. Could you put those in the Q&A and he'll handle those at the end, please? Thank you. A week after the webinar, we're going to send you an email with a recording of the webinar itself and the link to your online certificate. You generate this for yourself via an online form. So don't worry if you've registered with slightly the wrong spelling of your name. You'll be able to update that when you get your certificate. If you don't find you received the email after filling in the form, please can you check your junk folder, or you might need to try again to see you didn't put your email address in incorrectly. Now, an overview of the webinar we're going to run today. There's an expectation that students come to a class already competent to some extent in speaking. And perhaps this is because of the teaching of speaking as a key language skill gets neglected at times. In this talk, we'll look at what some of the experts say about speaking, and in particular, their opinions on fluency and accuracy, and the use and the learning situation of the student's own primary language. We'll also consider exactly what speaking involves, not just from a linguistic point of view, but also by considering that learning to speak a foreign language requires more than knowing its grammatical and semantic rules. Finally, participants will be able to try out a reciprocal speaking and listening activity and look at how theory translates in practice in Cambridge University Press coursebooks. Right, I'm shortly going to hand over to Peter Lucantoni, who is the Professional Learning and Development Manager in MENA at Cambridge University Press. Peter has had a long career in English language teaching, teacher training and management in Europe and the Middle East, and is now based in Cyprus. He's the author and co-author of a range of popular course books for students, including Cambridge IGCSE English as a Second Language and Introduction to English as a Second Language, both published by Cambridge University Press. Peter is Professional Learning and Development Manager for Cambridge University Press and regularly speaks at ELT conferences and trains teachers in both the public and private sectors. Right, that's all from me. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. I'll join you again for the Q&A at the end. Now over to Peter Lucantoni. So I'm going to invite Peter to share his screen.
Thanks very much, Tamsin. Hello, everybody. Here in Cyprus, it's still morning, but I think for some of you, it's afternoon and maybe even the evening. Tamsin, you need to let me share my screen.
There you go, Peter. You should be able to share your screen now.
Okay. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
I can see your screen, Peter.
Okay, great. All right. So, hello again, everybody. Do we need theory to teach speaking skills? We're going to try to answer that question in the next hour or so. I'm not promising that we'll have a definitive answer, but there will be an opportunity for you to ask further questions, as Tamsin said, towards the towards the end. Just very quickly, my name is Peter Lucantoni. That's an Italian surname. My dad was Italian, but my mum is English. I was born in the UK and I was educated there. I've been working in ELT in various roles over the last 40 years as a teacher, like many of you, as a manager, as a teacher trainer, as an author, as an educational consultant. And I now work for Cambridge University Press as the Professional Learning and Development Manager across the MENA region. And I have a background with Cambridge Assessment, with the TKT test, which you may be familiar with, the CELTA and the CELT-YL, the Young Learner version of CELTA as a trainer. And in the past, I've been a Delta trainer and also an assessor for the CELT-YL. So what I'd like to try and do in the next hour or so is basically to answer some questions and refer to these points. First of all, we're going to have a look at what the experts say, and then have a look at this issue of accuracy versus fluency, and have a think about what speaking actually involves, and think about whether or not students should be using any of the L1, their primary language, in the language classroom and in their learning. And we'll end up by doing a reciprocal speaking and listening activity. Now, unfortunately, I'm not able to see the chat box. So Tamsin, maybe you or somebody else, when I ask a question, you could let me know what the participants are actually writing in the chat box. Would that be okay?
Absolutely, absolutely, Peter. I can read those out to you.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks very much. All right, so let's begin then by having a think about what the experts say. And we have one of the greatest ELT experts on the screen. Anybody know who this is? Very, very famous, comes from New Zealand. It's been involved with Cambridge University Press for many, many, many years. Just type in the chat box if you know who this is.
We have a Jack Richards.
Yes, yes. I don't know who said that, but well done, whoever said it. This is Jack Richards, ELT author, and very, not just an author of course books, for example, Interchange, the famous Interchange course book, Four Corners, and many other course books. But Jack Richards was also responsible, if that's the right word, for coming up with a definition, if you like, of communicative language teaching and making communicative language teaching available, if you like, and understandable to all of us in the ELT profession. But specifically with speaking, Jack Richards said this about speaking. He said that the ability to speak a second language well is a very complex task. Now, of course, we don't know specifically what he meant when he talks about complexity, but the fact that he's made a point about it, saying that the ability to speak a second language well, it's a very complex task. It's a challenge. It's difficult for students. So we know from the experts that speaking is one of the most difficult language skills for students to acquire. A second expert, this gentleman here, not as famous as Jack Richards, but this is a gentleman called Chris Candlin. And Chris Candlin makes the point that actually getting students to talk is one of the biggest challenges that we face in the language classroom. And specifically, he says this, that getting students to talk is the major and one of the most difficult tasks confronting any teacher. I wish I could see the chat box because I'd like to ask you to what extent you actually agree with that. Do you think that getting students to talk is the major and one of the most difficult tasks confronting any teacher? I guess it depends very much on the particular context within which you're living and working, to what degree English is actually used. Is English a second language? Is it a foreign language? Is it a third language?
Everyone totally agrees, Peter.
Yeah, okay, great, good to hear. So the expert got it right. It's good to hear that the experts know what they're talking about. And a third expert that I'd like to bring to your attention is this gentleman here. This is Paul Seligson. Paul Seligson has written a number of course books and also books focusing on speaking. Particularly interesting and famous one is simply called Helping Students to Speak. And Paul Seligson makes a point which I think we would all agree with, is that we can't expect our students to become totally fluent in English as a second or a third language. But what we can do is to help them to become more confident in their use of language. And he says this: very few students will become fluent speakers, but they can probably speak more than they do now, and they can easily be made to feel more comfortable. And it's that last part of the quote that I've chosen to show you, which I think is important for us as educators. What we're trying to do is not to make our students fluent. Obviously, some will become very proficient, but I think the most important thing for most of us is that what we should be trying to do is to make our students feel more comfortable when they're using spoken language. And I want to just show you a couple of examples from Cambridge University Press course books, which I think highlight how course materials and therefore we, the educators, can help our students to become more comfortable. So here's an example from Cambridge Global English, which some of you may be teaching from at the moment. This is from stage 8. And the reason I'm showing this particular example from the course book is I think it's a nice example of how we can help students to become, or at least to feel more comfortable before we ask them to actually go into a speaking activity. So if you look at number 3 at the top, work with a partner, talk about the languages you speak. So that's an introductory speaking activity, no focus on language, but it's just to get students talking about the languages which they speak. And you'll see the bullet under number 3, choose 1 or 2 of the statements in exercises 1 and adapt them so they're true for you. Now you can't see exercise 1, but exercise 1 has got some statements, some functional language which students can use when they get to exercise 3. And I think this support for students is one way that we can make them feel more comfortable. And then if you look at exercise 4, complete the sentences with all, both, neither, and every. And remember to use of where it's necessary. So again, we've got some functional, some phrases that students can use in order to support their language when they move into the speaking activity. And the speaking activity, the real speaking activity, is number 5. Work with a partner or in small groups. Think of your family and friends. Talk about the languages they speak. And in the green box underneath, my parents live in, both of them speak, neither of them speaks. So using the language which has been practiced in the previous activities. So I think this is a nice example of how we can help students to feel more comfortable, even though we're not attempting for them to reach any level of fluency. Let's go to a much lower stage 3. This is from Cambridge Global English stage 3. Whoops. And you'll see this one is has got lots of pictures in it. A great way to support students, make them feel comfortable about what they're doing. And you'll notice at the top, it actually doesn't even use the word speaking. It says talk about it. Do you go to a big school or a little school? What do you like about it? And then before the students have to speak, they have to listen. And there, of course, is the model. And as with writing, we provide students with models of what we want them to write through asking them, first of all, to read and to see models of written language. Equally with speaking, we need students to listen to models before we actually get them to speak. So first of all, the students have to listen to an interview with Mark and Sophia. And then you'll see there's a chunk of language underneath. I like blank schools better because blank. And then supportive pictures underneath. And then if we go back up the scale, this is to an example from one of my course books, IGCSE English as a Second Language. And you'll see the support, the way that we make students comfortable in section A, 1 and 2. First of all, students have to watch a video of a student, somebody like themselves. It could be somebody very similar to one of their colleagues, their peers in the classroom, listening to another student and realizing that you know, I'm not alone in this. There are other students like me who face exactly the same challenges and problems that I do. And then the actual speaking activity starts with section B, speaking and vocabulary. And it says, look at the pictures of some facilities in schools, work in small groups, answer the questions which follow. So a lot of pictures again to support the students. So just going back to Paul Seligson, remember what he said was that we can't really expect our students to become fluent speakers, but what we can do is help them to speak more than they currently are doing, and hopefully to make them feel more comfortable in using language. So Paul Seligson has used that word fluent, and I know that you know, we're often very concerned about fluency and accuracy. So I want to show you now something that this lady said. I don't know if you know who this lady is, but her name is Penny Ur. Probably her most famous book was Grammar Practice Activities. And Penny Ur said that students learning fluency without accuracy is one of the biggest threats. Let's just look at that again. Students learning fluency without accuracy is one of the biggest threats. 30 seconds in the chat box. What do you think? Agree? Disagree?
Oh, we've got some lovely things. Yes, she is eminent. Agree, agree. So many agrees coming through. Oh, they use her book. Fantastic.
Excellent, excellent. Great to hear. Yeah.
Lots of totally agrees. I couldn't see any more agrees.
Yeah. Brilliant. So Penny Ur is telling us that students learning fluency without accuracy is one of the biggest threats. In other words, yes, of course, we want our students to be fluent, but fluent without accuracy? Where's the communication? Is there going to be any real communication if students are fluent in inverted commas with their language, but lacking in accuracy? And going back to Jack Richards, in a very famous paper that Jack Richards wrote called Communicative Language Teaching Today, Jack Richards said this, that people learn a language best when using it to do things and through communicating in it. So just look at that first bit again. People learn a language best when using it to do things and through communicating in it. Both accuracy and fluency, therefore, are goals of CLT, Communicative Language Teaching. That's really important, isn't it? People learn a language best when they're actually using it, when they're using it to do something, not through mechanical activities, not through rote learning activities. I think it's true to say there is a place for controlled practice activities in learning a language, but what's the point if all language learning is just rote learning and learning how to do things accurately? There comes a time when we need to put that learning of accuracy into practice. And that's what Jack Richards is saying. People learn a language best when they're using it to do things and through communicating in it. And both, therefore, accuracy and fluency are the goals. So sticking on this topic of accuracy versus fluency, I want to introduce you to a gentleman called Hemmings, and he talks about accuracy in the teaching of English. And he begins by saying this. I'll just leave you to read that for a few seconds. So he's making several points here, and I'll consolidate these in just a minute. But he's saying that ultimately this is our goal, this is what we want. We must want our students to be successful language users. So what does that actually mean? Well, they need to be able to communicate in any situation. They need to have full comprehension, and they need to be confident and effective in their adopted language. In other words, in using a language which is not their primary language. And he continues by bringing us back to this idea of fluency and accuracy. And he says this: in order to do the previous things, students need to be both fluent in their communication and accurate in their language choice. And I think very importantly, he says it's not an either or situation. In other words, I can either be accurate or I can be fluent. No, he doesn't say that. What he's saying is it's actually both. So there isn't actually an argument of accuracy versus fluency. What it should be really is accuracy and fluency. It's not one or the other. We don't have a choice. What we need to do is make sure that our students are competent, both from the point of view of accuracy and from the point of view of fluency. So bringing all of that together, as I said, I'll consolidate the points that Hemmings makes. So he says that ultimately, what we're trying to achieve is successful language learners. Now, successful, obviously, the adjective there has different meanings in different contexts, and everybody will have a different understanding of what successful means, but that's okay. But think about your particular context, think about your particular learners. What do they need to achieve in order to be successful in terms of using English? Hemmings says that students need to be able to communicate in any situation. Any only has 3 letters, but it's a very, very big word, isn't it? Any situation. I don't know if I necessarily agree 100% with that, but I think able to communicate in any situation relevant to their particular needs, whether that be, you know, to pass an examination or to get through checkpoint or, you know, whatever it is. So I think any is maybe slightly misleading. So think about your situation, think about your learner's situation, and I think, you know, slightly adapt what Hemmings is saying. You want your students to be able to communicate in the situations which are specifically relevant for them. He also talks about full comprehension. I think we can get away with 90% comprehension. I don't think I always fully understand when I'm speaking to people in my first language, English. It doesn't always matter, but I think the idea is that, you know, you need to have a very, very high level of comprehension in order to be able to communicate effectively. Very importantly, and this goes back to what we were talking earlier when Seligson was saying that we want our students to feel comfortable. Of course, what we want is our students to feel confident about using language. And I think with confidence comes the ability to be effective in using language. If you're confident, you don't mind if you make a few mistakes. You don't mind if things go wrong sometimes, because you have the confidence to backtrack and have another attempt. And bringing us back to the accuracy and the fluency issue, he says that we want our students to be fluent in their communication, not needing to spend too much time thinking about what they want to say, for the language to flow naturally, even if it's not 100% accurate. And his final point that he made in the 2 previous quotations is that we want our students ultimately to be accurate in their language choice. Now, I don't think we're talking about 100% accuracy, but I think the point, you know, what we need to take from what Hemmings has said is that it's not fluency versus accuracy, or accuracy versus fluency, or one or the other. We want both. We want students to be both fluent in their communication and accurate in their language choice. So what then does that mean for us as teachers, as educators? I think we need to think about what's going on in the classroom. We need to consider what we're doing with our students. We need to consider how we as teachers react to this issue of accuracy and fluency in the classroom. But I think the most important thing here is to remove the versus word and to think about the 2 together. And I think it's possible for fluency to support accuracy and vice versa. So teachers or educators, we need to use our fluency activities to support accuracy activities and vice versa. So we need accuracy activities to support fluency activities as well. So you need to think as a teacher, how can I do this, and what would the process be, and what would be the chronological order, if you like? What do I need to focus on first? And I think that's a choice that you need to make yourself with your students. I think it's true to say that accuracy work can actually come before or even after fluency. If you do the accuracy for work first, the controlled practice, practice of a new grammatical structure or a grammatical phrase or whatever it might be, that could come before the students do the fluency activity, or indeed after, if you determine that there are issues during the activity. Do remember though that fluency work is probably going to require a little bit more planning on the part of the teacher, because you need to think of activities, problems, if you like, tasks that the students can do, which will effectively practice fluency for help the students to develop their fluency. Do remember also the word feedback. It's incredibly important that we provide students with feedback on their language use. Otherwise, students are going to get to the point where they're thinking, well, why am I doing this? There's no purpose in doing this. I'm not being told, I'm not being given any feedback on my performance. I don't know if I've been successful or not. I don't know if I've been effective. I don't know if I've communicated well. So it's incredibly important that students are given feedback on their language use. So what then is a fluency activity? What makes a fluency activity effective? And I want to bring you now to another expert, a gentleman called Paul Nation. And Paul Nation has certain conditions for effective fluency activities. There are 3 conditions basically which he discusses. And I'm going to show you what the 3 conditions are, but I've left a word out of each of the 3 conditions, and I've given you the first letter. So I'd like you to try and guess what you think the 3 conditions are. So if you'd like to just type in the chat box what you think the missing word is. Tamsin, if you could be ready to shout out some of the answers.
I'm ready.
I'd be grateful. Okay, so here's the first one. He begins by saying that all language items involved are already F to the students. So what do you think the F stands for?
We have foreign, familiar, fluency, fluent, fixed, familiar. Familiar is the main one coming through.
Okay, okay. Anything else? I'm not going to tell you the answer just yet. Any other suggestions?
Coming through, what else is coming through? We've had so many that are just flowing in. Lots of familiar and fixed.
Okay, okay. All right, that's great. We'll have a look at what the answer is in just a second. The second condition is this. The focus is on see, not form in real time.
Oh, we had a focus there, and then content,
Okay.
communication, context, confidence,
Okay.
context,
Okay.
communication, comprehension, clarity and context.
Okay.
So many answers. Thank you, everyone. Comfortable, context, concept, clarity.
Okay, great. Lovely. Again, I'll give you the answer in just a second. And the third one, S are in place for students to outperform their normal proficiency. So any guesses for S?
Same, speaking, steps, support, stimuli, situations, speaking, spontaneous, strategies, stimuli, support, schools, samples, stages, situation, scaffolding. Brilliant. So many suggestions.
Okay. Okay. Thanks everybody for doing it. And I'm really sorry that I can't see for myself what you're writing in the chat box. For all 3 of these, I heard the correct answer. So well done to those of you who got the correct word. So let's have a look at what the 3 things are. The first one was familiar. So all the language items involved are already familiar to the students. Let's just check, remind ourselves of what we're doing here. We're looking at conditions for effective fluency activities. In other words, if we want a fluency activity to be effective, if we want it to encourage our students to speak fluently, then the language items, in other words, the words, the grammatical structures, the functions, the idioms, etc., they have to be familiar to the students. If they're not, how can they be fluent? Just ask yourselves that. So if we want a fluency activity to be more effective, we don't want students to be struggling to find vocabulary and grammar in order to complete the activity. Fluency comes when students don't have to think so much about language, when they don't have to think so much about language choice. We want fluency to mean a fast, not fast is the wrong word, but a delivery of language without students having to pause and think too much. We all think about language before we produce anything. We all go through that process. I'm doing it now as I deliver this webinar to you. I'm thinking about my choice of words. But what we don't want are long pauses where students are trying to find a word which maybe they don't even know. So it's incredibly important. It's one of the conditions that the language items involved are already familiar to the students. The second one, and again, I heard some of you say the word, or I heard Tamsin say the word communication. The focus is on communication, not form, in real time. The focus is on communication. So remind ourselves what we're looking at here are conditions for effective fluency activities. So we don't want there to be concerns about making mistakes. We don't want concerns about inaccuracies. The focus has to be on communication, dealing with a problem, completing a task, whatever it might be, an information gap, an exchange of information. And we're not worried if the students make too many mistakes. And the third one, and this is probably one that I think you found the most difficult when you were giving your answers in the chat box. But although I did hear the correct answer, so well done to those of you who got it. But the third one is supports. Supports are in place for students to outperform their normal proficiency. In other words, how can we challenge the students to go beyond their normal proficiency? What can we do to push them just that little bit more? What can we do to make them outperform their normal proficiency? So, a little activity for you. I'm going to give you the first letter of 6 words which describe effective fluency activities. So what I want you to do, and again, Tamsin, you need to be on the ball here, is to tell me what you think these words are. So we're still focusing on effective fluency activities, and we're looking now at 6 aspects, if you like, of an effective fluency activity. So the first one begins with P, and I actually just gave you the answer.
Practice, I've got coming through.
Not practice,
Practical.
but very close. Practical. Excellent. Good. So now you get the idea, because I made a mistake. What about number 2? Number 2 begins with F. The activity needs to be what? Any ideas?
Fluency, fun, focus, familiar, frequent, focused, familiar.
Okay,
Lots of ideas.
I've heard the answer, and it's focused. So we're going to look at what all of these mean in just a minute. So let's just play the game first, and then we'll see what they mean. Let's have another P. Obviously, it's not practical again. It's something different this time. I'll give you a clue. It's P-R-E. Pre what?
Pre, so presented, prepared, precise, proficient, prepared, preparation, practice, presentations. Oh, they're coming through so fast. Precise.
Okay, I haven't heard the answer yet. Okay, I'll give you another letter. D. P-R-E-D.
Predicted, predetermined,
Close.
predictable.
Close. Okay, yeah, there we go. Predictable. Very good. Well done. And the fourth one begins with the letter N. The activity needs to be practical, focused, predictable, and N.
New, negotiate, natural.
Okay, I've heard the answer. Excellent, good. Natural. Yeah. Okay, 2 more. The next one is G. Give me an adjective beginning with G.
General, goal, generous, great, genuine, good, goal-orientated, guided, lots of guided, genuine.
I like guided. Guided's great, but it's not. I haven't heard the word. It's a bit more difficult, this one. Number 5 is generative.
Generative.
Generative. As I said, we'll look at what all of these mean in just a minute. And the last one begins with the letter V. Any ideas?
Variety, varied, vital, visual.
Oh, lovely.
Various, vision,
Yeah.
vocabulary, variable, varied.
I haven't heard the answer yet. Give me another word for flexible. Or many uses.
Variable.
Yeah.
Varied, variety, versatile.
Versatile, there we go. It needs to be versatile as well. Great. So what do all of these words mean? I'm going to give you the 6 meanings, but they're all jumbled up. So you need to match the meanings with the 6 words on the screen. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I'm going to give you A, B, C, D, E, F. You need to match 1 to 6 with A to F, and I will give you 60 seconds. And I suggest don't do them one by one, do all 6, and don't type anything in the chat box until you've done all 6. Okay, here we go. So you have 60 seconds starting now. And I've just noticed a typo in F. It should be produce lots of language, not product lots of language. Apologies. Okay, that's 60 seconds. Tamsin, any answers coming through?
We're getting so many answers coming through. 1B, 2D, 3E, 4B, 5C, 6A from Monica.
Okay.
We've got 1B, 2D, 3E, 4C, 5F, 6A from Marwa. From Ryan, we've got 1B, 2D, 3E, 4C, 5F, 6A. From Seb, we've got 1D, 2D, 3E, 4C, 5F, 6A. So,
yeah,
so many answers coming through. Yeah. Thank you, brilliant. Everybody.
Okay, so let's have a look then. First of all, we want the activity to be practical. And by practical here, we mean we want the activity to be easy to set up and easy to manage from the teacher's perspective. I don't know if any of you are ever involved in observing each other, observing your colleagues, something that I have done a lot in the past. I still do quite a lot. And I sometimes see activities which last barely a minute or even, even less, speaking activities. And when I ask the teacher about the preparation that went into them, I often hear answers such as, oh, it took me hours to think of this and cut up all the bits of paper and to do this and to do that. But in the classroom, the activity only took 30, 60 seconds for the students to complete. So it's very important that we think about, how much time and effort has gone into the activity, how easy is it to set up in the classroom, and how easy is it to manage. We love students working in groups. We love students changing groups, changing partners, but how complicated is that in a particular classroom context? So make sure that your speaking activities are practical in terms of ease of setup and their management. Second one is I think very important and something that we tend to forget when we're getting students to do things in the classroom, not just when we get them to speak, but when we get them to do other things as well. We want the activity to have a focus. It needs to have a purpose. It needs to have a goal. And of course, that goal needs to be very clear to our students. If the students don't know why they're doing something, how engaged, how motivated are they actually going to be? So the activity needs to be focused. It needs to have a purpose. Remember what Paul Nation said earlier about the language which should be used in an effective fluency activity. He said that all the language items involved are already familiar to the students. So when we talk about predictability, the language which the students use has to be language which can be anticipated. In other words, when you set up the speaking activity, you can say to your students, now, students, what language are you going to use in this activity? What vocabulary are you going to need? Which tenses are you going to use more than others? And if the students don't know, then it's not going to be an effective speaking activity. So make sure that the language output from the students is language which can be anticipated. Or if you can't yet if you can anticipate the language, then of course you're in a position to support the students with that language before they actually do the activity. The fourth point was natural, and by natural, we mean that the activity needs to encourage the language which we've predicted. It shouldn't be forced. There should be opportunities for the students to use the language in a fairly natural way. Of course, it's never going to be 100% natural. How can it be? But we want it to encourage students to use language in a natural way as far as possible. But at the same time, of course, the fifth word, generative, we also want the activity to produce lots of other language. So the students are not just practicing the anticipated language, the target language, if you like, the focused language, but to produce other language around the target language as well. And why not, for the sixth aspect, let's try and make the activity as versatile as possible, and therefore we can adapt it for other levels. Obviously, the predictability of the activity for other levels, the anticipated language will be different, but for all the other aspects, it could very much be the same. So how does this work in practice? Let's have a look. The course books do it again. Here's an example from Global English Stage 6. And I appreciate it's quite small on the screen, but maybe some of you are using this course book, Cambridge Global English, or one of the other stages. But I think you'll agree that it covers the 6 points we've just made. It's practical, it's focused, it's predictable, it's natural, it's generative, and it also has a degree of versatility. And here's an example from my own Cambridge IGCSE English as a Second Language coursebook. Here we have a speaking activity, which is a paired speaking activity. You can see towards the bottom, exercise 3, find a partner, student A and student B. Again, I think we have an example here of a speaking activity which encourages practicality. It's focused, it's predictable, it's natural, it's generative, and it's versatile as well. Okay, so we've looked at what the experts say. We've looked at accuracy and fluency. Let's have a look now at what speaking actually involves. And this lady on the screen now, a lady called Kang Xiumin, she makes the point that if you want to speak, she calls it a foreign language, but you know, it could be a second or a third language, or any language which is not your primary language. She says it's not just about knowing the grammar and the semantics. It's not just about, you know, understanding what words mean. So the quote I have on the screen is that she says that learning to speak a foreign language requires more than knowing its grammatical and semantic rules. And she specifies 5 things that we need to be able to do in order to speak a foreign language. And I'm going to show you now 5 little pictures, and I hope the pictures will help you to think of what the 5 things actually are. And remember, we're talking about learning to speak a foreign language needs more than knowing its grammatical and semantic rules. So here's my first picture. You can see this guy here is scratching his head. So he wants to say something. So what do you think he's doing? Just type very quickly in the chat box. Sorry, Tamsin, if you could be...
We've got thinking there.
Good. Yeah, thinking about what though?
thinking vocabulary, thinking framework, diction,
Okay.
memory, looking for the right word, trying to speak, choosing the right word.
Lovely. Okay, brilliant. Okay, great. Second one. This is me struggling to find a picture that symbolizes what Kang Shumin said, but here's my second one. Any ideas?
Let's see, tools, organization, stationery.
Lovely. Yeah,
organizing
what? Organizing what?
Working tools, office supplies.
Yeah, the pictures are linked. So what was the first guy doing?
So it's thoughts and ideas we have coming through, organizing words.
Right, lovely. Okay, perfect. We got it. Great, brilliant. And the third one, what do I have to do next?
Utter, we've got there.
Okay.
Speaking, setting up.
Yeah. How do we speak? What do we have to do?
Express.
Okay, but how do we express?
Pronunciation, articulate.
Okay. Yeah. What do
practicing.
Okay, what do we use in order to
move our mouths, tongue?
Yeah, brilliant. Fantastic. Okay, great. Now this one is probably going to be impossible for you to get, but you can have a guess. What do we do once we've said something?
Hearing, listening.
Yeah, listening to who?
So listen, pronunciation.
Who do we
listen to the speaker.
So who's doing the speaking?
Listen to ourselves.
Yes, brilliant. Okay, great, excellent. And the last one, United Nations. Any ideas?
Sharing.
Okay, great.
Communication, unity.
Yeah.
Collaboration.
Okay.
Global, culture.
Yeah. Okay, great, good. Okay, so let's put that into an easier format. First of all, we need to recall and select the appropriate words. So upstairs in our brains, we all have a word bank. But as a user of language, what we need to do is, first of all, remember, we need to recall all of the words which are in our brain, and we need to select the word which is appropriate for the particular situation which we find ourselves in. So this is what my first picture is showing. It's showing somebody trying to remember the word that they need for a particular situation that they find themselves in. Again, this is not just about your second or your third language. We do this in our first language as well. How many times have you sat and said, oh, it's on the tip of my tongue, I can't remember the word, I'm thinking of the word. So it's obviously it happens more as when it's your second language, but it certainly happens in our first language as well. And once we've recalled the word, and indeed the words, because we wouldn't just normally say one word, we then have to organize the words into units of language, chunks of language, if you prefer, phrases of language. So let's just very quickly, if you don't mind, go back. What did Kang Shumin said? She said, learning to speak a foreign language requires more than knowing its grammatical and semantic rules. So she says, we need to first of all recall, and then we need to organize. And then of course, we need to get the sound out. And the way we get the sound out is we use our lips and our tongue, our mouth, to form intelligible sounds. If you put your hand over your mouth, then you won't be making an intelligible sound. If a student is sitting at their desk, resting their chin on their hand, then they won't be making an intelligible sound. If you're eating an ice cream, then you won't be able to make an intelligible sound. But once we have made the sound, we then need to monitor the sound and correct if necessary. And again, this is not just a second language thing, this happens in our first language as well. We need to be monitoring the sounds which are coming out and correcting if necessary. And the third one is it's a cognitive thing. It's not a physical thing. It's going back to the cognitive side. It's being aware of social and cultural conventions. Can I use this word? Can I use this phrase? Can I say this in a particular social context or a particular culture that I find myself in? Okay, so looking at the third one, the movement of the lips and the tongue, I guess this is what we would call the focus on the pronunciation or the focus on the phonetics. And I think it's sometimes an area which we as educators tend to neglect because maybe we're not confident about helping our students with pronunciation. But do remember, at the end of the day, the teacher is the best model that students could ever have. And Cambridge University Press course books do help students with pronunciation. Here's an example from Cambridge Global English Stage 6. You can see over on the right part of the menu from Global English Stage 6. And this is what it's called the pronunciation and the word study section. And then down the bottom of the page, you can see an activity which focuses on the sound ch, as in cheese. Listen and repeat these words from the story. So the students have seen and heard the words in the story. Which two letters make the ch sound in the last two words, adventure and actually? So it's making very clear here that even if the letters C and H don't appear, it's still possible that phonetically the sound ch can appear in a word, as in adventure and actually. So both formed around the letters T and U. So again, support is there in the course books, making students more comfortable. Okay, the final point I wanted to very quickly talk about, we could spend 6 hours on this and I don't want to labor it, but this question of whether or not students should be using their first language, their primary language in their learning. Indeed, should teachers be using any L1 in the classroom? You know, there are so many arguments about this and so many cases. I'm not going to take a side, but I want to give you both sides of the argument, if I may. I know that in some contexts, using the first language is banned. Certainly, in many places I go to in the Middle East, I'm told that the use of Arabic is 100% banned. And then I go into a classroom and I observe a lesson and I definitely hear Arabic being used. As I say, I'm not here to make a judgment on it, but I just think it's a reality. And I also think it's very unrealistic to expect students to go through long days of lessons and not expect them to use a little bit of their L1. But anyway, David Atkinson, who you may have come across, he says this, and I'll leave you to read this for a few seconds. And I think this is an essential point to raise as we deal with this question of whether or not students should use any L1. For many learners, in particular, adults and teenagers who are more restrained, they're more frightened of making mistakes in the second language, occasional use of the L1 gives them the opportunity to show that actually they're intelligent, sophisticated people. If a student is struggling to use L1, they may have a brilliant idea, they may have the answer, but they may be restricted in giving the answer because they're worried about using English. So maybe just a little opportunity, you know, tell me in the first language and then you can tell me in English. Just that little bit of support will make them feel more comfortable and give them a little bit of confidence. And Atkinson goes on to say that he's not saying that we should suddenly start using L1. He's not saying that at all. And he makes the point that English should, of course, be the language used for the majority of time in any class. If it's not, then it's not an English class, is it? It becomes something completely different. But he says that we need to think of the balance between English and the first language, and that will depend on many factors. And he lists several. And the four I want to highlight here are these, but just look at this. He says the balance between English and L1 will probably depend on many factors. And he mentions students' previous learning experiences. How have they learned English before coming to you as their teacher? what's their level? Where are they in the course? Is it the beginning of the academic year? Is it the end? And indeed, what about the lesson? Is it the beginning of the lesson, or is it the end of the lesson? So all of these factors may have an impact on the balance between using English and L1. Imagine a student who's been in a learning experience where there was a lot of use of L1, and then they come to your classroom where there's none. That may impact on whether or not you decide to use a bit of L1 with them or not. What about their level? Of course, we want to expose students to as much English as possible, but we also have to take into consideration that students at very, very low levels do not have the breadth and depth of language so that they can communicate in English, you know, for a full 40, 45, 50-minute lesson, whatever it might be. And what if they have a double lesson? That's an enormous amount of time for students to be producing English. The stage of the course, if it's the beginning of the school year, then maybe you want to spend some time communicating with students in their L1 so that they understand the rules and the procedures and maybe the outcomes and the expectations. And indeed, in the lesson, if you want to be explaining to students what the aims and the objectives are, what the instructions are for a complex activity, perhaps slightly more use of L1 might be useful. And Jane Willis, who you may have come across Jane Willis, or maybe her husband, Dave Willis. They were a team, University of Birmingham, I think it was, in the UK, did a lot of work on task-based learning. But Jane Willis makes the point that maybe at certain times during a lesson, you can actually save time if you drop English just for a few seconds. So her quote is this: that there are times when it's preferable and more economical as far as time is concerned to drop English for a few seconds. And she gives these examples, and some of them reinforce what we've just seen from David Atkinson. But she says that possibly you want to explain the meaning or the use of a new word. Now, I know all the arguments about yes, 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 but you can always show a picture, you can always do this, you can always do that. But, you know, for more abstract words, for words which are more complex, then possibly a quick translation can save you, the teacher, an enormous amount of time. She also says that maybe explaining aims and learning outcomes, you know, do it in L1, you can save a lot of time, which could be better spent on actually teaching the students. Maybe checking students' understanding, particularly with students who need a bit more time. Okay, tell me in your first language, and then tell me in English. Or maybe to check the main points or the main ideas of something that's been read. And just going back to Atkinson, Atkinson talks about having problem clinics, which I think is a nice idea. You know, possibly having a timeout during a lesson or even after a lesson in the break, where students can come to you and use their first language in order to discuss a point that they haven't understood. And of course, something that we're seeing more and more nowadays, and I've used it in my own books, is contrastive analysis, getting students to think about their L1. How do you say this in your language? And you can see an example from my introduction to English as a second language, where the new word on the left is altitude. The grammar is given, the noun, an example sentence is given. The spacecraft flew at an altitude of 5 kilometers above the Earth. So what would that word be in your language? What's the translation in your language? So students can write that translation in their course book so they can contrast it with the word in English. I think you can see from that that I do support moderate, restricted use of L1 in the classroom. Okay, so I've spent the last hour talking to you about the theories behind speaking, and I thought it'd be nice to end up with an activity which hopefully you'll be able to use in your classrooms. So I'm going to go through the activity with you. It's called a reciprocal speaking and listening activity. And the idea with this is that the students are basically the teachers. The students work in small groups, groups of 4 if possible. And this activity is a speaking and a listening activity. The teacher, the role of us is to model the activity and then guide your students in the activity using 4 different strategies. So let's imagine that we have our students in 4 groups, and the students in the groups are going to take on a role, or if you like, they're going to practice a different strategy. And the 4 strategies are to summarize, to question, to clarify, and to predict. So before we do the activity, let's just check we understand what those 4 strategies are. So the person who's the summarizer in the group, their role is to highlight key ideas from what they've listened to. The role of the questioner is to ask a question based on what they've listened to. The clarifier needs to answer the questioner's questions and clear up any confusion, deal with any problems that may have arisen. And the predictor needs to predict what they think they're going to listen to next. Now, you can also use this as a reciprocal reading and listening activity. It would work in exactly the same way, but for the purposes of today, we're going to do it as a speaking and a listening activity. So let me just backtrack. First of all, we put our students into groups of 4. Each person in the group takes on a role. One is the summarizer, one's the organizer, the questioner, one's the clarifier, and one's the predictor. You need to think about your students. You need to allocate the roles based on their abilities. If students are struggling, you may want to give that particular student the role of the questioner. The stronger students could be the clarifiers, the summarizers, and the predictors. If you can't have groups of 4 and you can only have groups of 3 or 2, then one student could take on 2 of the roles, for example. One student could be a summarizer and a predictor. So you can set this up in whatever way suits your particular situation. So I'm going to read you something from one of my course books. And as you listen, I want you to take on the role of either a summarizer, a questioner, a clarifier, or a predictor. Now, I think there is something like nearly 900 of you listening into this webinar today. So obviously it's impossible for me to allocate a role to you. So just decide for yourselves which one you want to do. Do you want to be the summarizer, the questioner, the clarifier, or the predictor? And hopefully we'll get a spread of everybody. So what I want you to do is to listen to the first part of a listening text from Introduction to English as a Second Language. And as you listen, engage with your role and either be ready to summarize what you've heard, to ask a question about what you've heard. If you've chosen the role of clarifier, you've chosen a difficult role because you don't know what the questions might be. And if you choose predictor, then you need to predict what you think is going to be happening in the second part of what you're going to listen to. And when I finish listening, Tamsin, I don't know how you can do this, but yes. I'm going to ask Tamsin to just read out a few of the comments that we get.
I will indeed.
Okay, so when I finish talking, in the chat box, just make a quick comment and let us know if you're summarizing, questioning, or predicting. And if you're clarifying, maybe hold off and see what some of the questions are. Okay, here we go. Here's the first part of the text. About 250 to 60 million years ago, during the age of the dinosaurs, the Earth was ruled by large mammals. The dinosaurs lived on the land, but they also roamed the open oceans and inland seas. However, by about 200 million years ago, many of these sea monsters had become extinct and dinosaurs had begun to dominate the planet. Okay, so summarize, questioners, question, predictors, predict, clarifiers, hold on a minute. So Tamsin, when you get something in the chat box?
I will share with you as soon as we've got something. I think everyone's having a little think at the moment.
Sure. I can read it again if people want me to.
Oh, summarizing. During the dinosaur age, dinosaurs lived on land and in the sea and slowly conquered the whole planet. Questioning, what is the meaning of dominant?
Great.
Why did they become extinct?
Great.
Summary, dinosaurs dominate the world.
Great.
Or origin and development of dinosaurs. Clarifier, waiting for questions.
Any
Predictor,
predictions? Yeah.
what will happen to the Earth?
Lovely. Can the clarifier answer any of the questions?
Lots of predictions coming through at the moment. Just waiting for our clarifiers. And we've got some more summaries coming through. Do we have any clarifiers who want to give me a clarification? Lots of questions. Why did mammals disappear? Oh, a clarification.
Yeah.
They are horrible mammals. Thanks to goodness there are no more now.
Excellent. I think you've all understood how this works. So that's our model, okay? And just to give you an example, here's my little summary. Reptiles and mammals died out, dinosaurs dominated. Of course, your summaries were great, in fact, better because your summaries were longer. A couple of questions that I thought of. What are reptiles and mammals? What does extinct mean? Clarify answering the questions. Snakes, lizard are reptiles. Mammals are warm-blooded and produce milk. Extinct means no longer living. And the predictor, information about the planet and movement through the ages. And I'm going to show you now the text that I read, and then we're going to move on and listen to the second part. So here's the actual text. I'll just give you a few seconds to read that. Okay. So now you're going to listen to a second part of the text. It says first part, but it should say second part. And again, engage with your role. Either summarize, question, clarify, or predict. It's entirely up to you. You can keep the same role that you had the first time, or you can change the role that you had. So here's the second part of the text. The continents joined into one supercontinent. But then this new continent split apart again, changing Earth's geography and climate. It became very green and very fertile, and grass-eating or herbivorous dinosaurs continued to thrive. Smaller meat-eating or carnivorous animals also increased. The first birds appeared in the skies, and flowering plants and insects established themselves. Okay, so once again, summarize, questioners question, predictors predict, clarifiers hold on a minute. So again, Tamsin, if you wouldn't mind.
So we've got loads of questions coming through. What are continents? What happened to continents? We've got some clarification coming through. The only continent was named Pangaea. Carnivores are eating other animals. Predictor, planet Earth will undergo many changes. Summarize, the Earth has some geographic changes and became new. Question, what are carnivores? Questions, what caused the continents to separate? Prediction, continents drifted apart.
Great. Lovely. Really, really nice. Okay, great. And here's just my responses. The world became one continent, then it split, very green, different types of animals increased, first birds. Questioner, how long did it take to form a supercontinent? What does establish mean? Clarify, we don't know the answer to the supercontinent question. Establish means to become permanent, and the predictor predicts details about the sea, more information about what happened next. And here's the text, just so you can have a quick read. Okay, so hopefully you've got the idea with this reciprocal speaking and listening activity. And just going back to some of the points we made earlier about what we should be looking for an activity to be effective in terms of fluency and indeed accuracy. We want it to be practical, we want it to be focused, we want it to be predictable, we want it to be natural, generative, and also versatile. Now, it's obviously difficult to set this activity up in the way that we're doing it today, but I think it works. This is not the first time I've done it in a webinar, and it definitely works, and hopefully you can see how to adapt this for the classroom. Focused, it definitely has a purpose, and each person within the group has a particular purpose and a particular goal. They have to summarize or question or clarify or predict. It's predictable in that there is a degree of anticipated language, because we want our students to use language for summarizing. We want students to use language for clarifying and indeed for predicting. And it's also a natural situation, because we're putting students into groups, working together, collaborating together. There's an enormous amount of opportunity for generative language. Lots of other languages going to be produced. And of course, you can use this with any level that you happen to be teaching. And as I said, you can also use it as a reading activity as well. So just to clarify again, remember that the students become the teachers in this activity. Your role as the teacher is first of all to model and then guide them in their groups using the 4 different strategies. So the teacher's role is very much, if you like, a role on the sidelines where you're listening in to what's going on. Remember I said that one student can be the summarizer for all the sections, or the roles can change as they listen to different sections, or indeed as they read to the different sections. That's entirely up to you. Remember also I said that one student could take on 2 of the roles, depending on the numbers that you have in the classroom. This particular text was a listening text from one of my books. All of the course books from Cambridge University Press, the listening texts are available, but you can do it with reading texts. You, the teacher, can read out the text to the students. There are many different ways that you can adapt this reciprocal speaking and listening activity. Okay, and that brings me to the end of everything I wanted to talk to you about today, but I think we need to have just a few conclusions before we move on to the questions. And the first conclusion is that we need to consider how students are speaking and not just worry about what they're saying. So the how comes back to the points that Kang Schumann was making about the ability to recall and to organize and to form words and phrases. So competence is not just about what, it's also about how we actually do it. And we heard Paul Seligson mention earlier about helping students to become comfortable. I'm using the word confidence here, but I think you'll agree that the 2 are inseparable. But building up their confidence is an essential part of the whole speaking and learning process. And I think confidence will come if we provide students with plenty of input, plenty of predictable language input, so that they can carry out the speaking activity. Let's not forget, and we've just seen this with the reciprocal activity, that listening is part of speaking. And it doesn't matter if you're speaking in the way that I'm speaking now. Obviously I can't listen to you, but I can listen to you through the chat box. And if I could see the chat box, I could listen even better than I'm doing at the moment. But do remember that whether you're speaking in a sort of a monologue, in a presentation style as I am, or you're sitting next to somebody and conversing, then obviously listening is an incredibly important part of speaking. And we've seen a lot of arguments about accuracy and fluency. And I think the conclusion is that we mustn't sacrifice fluency for accuracy. In other words, let's not focus too much on accuracy so that fluency suffers. But at the same time, flip it round, let's not sacrifice accuracy for fluency. So both are important, as we've seen. It's not one versus the other. It's not one or the other. It should be fluency and accuracy should be our goals. And the last conclusion I want to make is that if we want speaking to be effective in the classroom and for our students to become effective, natural speakers, then we need to do far more scaffolding. We need to scaffold, 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 or if you prefer, support, support, support. Provide learners with the scaffolding, provide them with the support so they're able to carry out the activities that we want them to carry out. In other words, let's focus on predictable language, not language which the students don't know, because that, of course, is incredibly unfair. So thank you so much for being here today. I hope it's been a useful webinar for you.